They threw a brick through the window and struck a newborn in the head. All because the Grace family had violated HOA rules. Behind it all stood Kelly Mason, the HOA president, who empowered fake officers to act like they ruled the neighborhood. But Nick and Allison fought back, armed with evidence, determination, and a quiet fury that reached the ears of federal investigators. Just wait until you see how this battle unfolded, and why in the end justice didn't just arrive. It hit exactly where it should. The Georgia sun hung high over Oakage Drive like a warm promise. It was one of those lazy afternoons where time seemed to stretch out over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. Lawnmowers buzzed in the distance. Birds chirped lazily from power lines, and the scent of fresh-cut grass floated through the air. In the heart of it all stood a modest cream-colored house with a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. Inside, Allison Grace, a 30-year-old mother with tired eyes and a heart full of love, rocked her newborn son Logan in her arms. The baby was wrapped in a pale blue blanket, his chest rising and falling in soft, rhythmic motions against her shoulder. She hummed something old and familiar, half lullaby, half prayer. Her husband, Nick, had just walked through the door. Dust clung to his boots, and the collar of his work shirt was damp with sweat. An electrical engineer by trade, Nick was meticulous and quiet, the kind of man who triple-checked every socket and kissed his wife on the forehead before saying a word. He toed off his boots in the foyer, cracked open a bottle of water, and sighed deeply. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life in a not-so-ordinary neighborhood. Their subdivision was governed by a local HOA, an association that didn't just monitor fences and lawns, but seemed to breathe down the neck of every homeowner. Still, Nick and Allison kept their heads down. They followed the rules, painted their fence when told, paid their dues on time. They didn't like the HOA, but they didn't challenge it either. That was before the black pickup truck pulled onto their street. It rolled slowly, deliberately, like it owned the road. The words HOA Enforcement Unit were stenciled in block letters on the side. No sirens, no license plates, no city markings. Just two men in tactical vests and black boots, climbing out with stiff, robotic movements. They weren't police, but they moved like they wanted to be. Nick stepped onto the porch, water bottle in hand, brows drawn into a tight frown. "Hey," he called. "What are you doing on our lawn? We haven't broken any rules." The taller of the two glanced at his partner and muttered something. Then he walked to the back of the truck, lifted the tailgate, and pulled something heavy from the bed. Allison stepped outside, cradling Logan against her chest, the baby's tiny hand gripping the collar of her shirt. "You can't just walk onto our property," she said, her voice trembling. "We didn't authorize any inspection." And that's when it happened. The man with the square jaw and cold stare suddenly turned, raised his arm, and hurled a brick straight at the living room window. The glass shattered with a thunderous crack. Nick dropped the bottle, arms reaching out instinctively, but too late. The brick struck Logan. It hit the baby's head with a dull, sickening thud before falling to the hardwood floor. The world froze. Allison didn't scream, not at first. She dropped to her knees like her legs had forgotten how to stand. Logan's body was limp in her arms. Blood smeared across her sleeve, and her mouth formed words but no sound came. Nick rushed to them, eyes wide in disbelief, hands shaking as he reached for his family. The two men jumped back into the truck and peeled away, tires squealing, disappearing around the corner before anyone could get a license plate number. Then came the scream. Raw. Endless. Allison rocked back and forth with Logan pressed to her chest. Nick fumbled with his phone, fingers clumsy and soaked in fear. The 911 operator's voice was calm, but nothing about that moment felt calm. The ambulance took 23 minutes. By the time they arrived, Logan was still breathing barely. But he was alive. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Everything looked clean, too clean, as if the white walls and shiny floors were trying to erase what had just happened. But the metallic scent of blood clung stubbornly to Allison's sweater, and the sharp tang of shattered glass lingered in her nostrils. She sat stiffly in a cold plastic chair, arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking slightly. Her eyes didn't blink much. Her lips moved, whispering fragments of old prayers, the kind passed down through generations not for peace, but for strength. Nick paced the hallway in tight, slow circles. He hadn't spoken in a while. In his hand, he held a jagged chunk of brick, the same one that had torn through their window and struck their son. It was still stained near the edge. He didn't know why he held on to it. Maybe he needed to. Maybe he wasn't ready to let it go. Detective Jared Wells stood nearby, leaning against the reception desk with the tired posture of a man who'd seen too much. He looked to be in his early 40s, with creases under his eyes and a badge clipped casually to his belt. His notebook was open, but his expression was unreadable. "You said the men were from the HOA?" he asked, pen hovering above the paper. Allison's head snapped up. "No," she said sharply. "They were not officers. They were wearing fake tactical gear. No name tags. No identification. They didn't speak like professionals. They spoke like people who came to send a message." Her voice trembled at the end. Wells nodded slightly and scribbled a few lines. "Unfortunately," he said, "HOA groups aren't official law enforcement. They're private organizations. Some have their own enforcement arms, sure, but they don't have the same oversight. A few even contract third-party security. It's messy." Nick stopped pacing. "They threw a brick," he said quietly, then louder. "They threw a brick at my child. They didn't ask questions. They didn't show paperwork. They attacked." His hand gripped the brick tighter. Wells sighed. Mistaken identity happens. Wrong address. Overreaction. It's not always malicious intent. Nick stepped closer. "You call this a mistake?" His voice cracked as he pointed at the red-stained brick. "This isn't a wrong address. This is a message. And it nearly ended my son's life." The detective looked down, avoiding eye contact. "If your son pulls through, you can pursue a civil case. Damages, liability, maybe negligence. But a criminal investigation? That's harder to build without direct evidence." He closed his notebook with a quiet snap. Allison didn't answer. She stared at the floor, still rocking. Her lips moved, but now no words came. The television in the waiting room played a cheerful segment about a local festival. Nothing about Oakage Drive. Nothing about what happened to Logan. No updates. No alerts. Just silence. Late that night, the HOA's official website posted a single line of text. *, we regret the misunderstanding on Oakage Drive. An internal investigation is underway. *. That was it. No mention of Allison. No apology. No responsibility. Just sterile distance. Nick didn't sleep that night. At 4:12 a.m. he sat in the kitchen, laptop open, the screen lighting his face in the dark. He'd worked in electrical systems long enough to understand digital infrastructure. The HOA website wasn't secure. Took less than an hour. He bypassed their basic protections and found their internal communications. Dozens of emails. Dozens of familiar names. But one name kept showing up over and over. Kelly Mason, HOA president. In message after message she referenced their house. Unapproved construction in the rear. Unresponsive homeowners. No cooperation from the city. And then, in a single email dated 3 days before the attack, the line that made Nick go still. "If the city won't do it, we will." Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't turn. Allison appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, eyes hollow and red. She looked at the screen, then at him. "She sent them," she said softly. "She gave the order to our baby." Nick turned the screen so she could read it for herself. The diagnosis came late into the night. Logan had suffered a traumatic brain injury with internal bleeding. The doctors were cautious, their words measured. Logan was stable but critical, under constant observation in the pediatric ICU. Tubes ran across his tiny body, and machines beeped softly beside him. Allison never left his side. She sat in the rigid hospital chair like it was her new home. One hand wrapped around Logan's fingers, the other clutching a blanket that still smelled like their living room. Her world had shrunk to that room, that bed, that moment. Everything else could wait. Nick didn't cry. He didn't shout. Instead, he went quiet in a way that didn't feel like grief. It felt like calculation. Something inside him shifted, hardened. His eyes lost their softness. "They're not walking away from this," he whispered to Allison. "I swear to you, none of them are walking away." By the following morning, Nick had already taken steps. He contacted a friend from college, someone now working in data and analytics for a satellite imaging firm. Within hours, he had overhead snapshots of their block from the past 72 hours. He cross-referenced timestamps with county traffic camera footage. Frame by frame, he tracked the black pickup as it rolled into the neighborhood and left minutes later. The license plate had been covered, but not completely. A few digits were visible. It was enough. The truck was registered to a Dave Thompson, a former security guard with a record of misconduct, fired after a physical altercation with a teenager. He now lived in a small house 2 towns over. Nick didn't stop there. He dug deeper and uncovered a second name. Ken Rudolph. No job. Living out of a trailer near the county's edge. A misdemeanor on file for assault. Nick compiled everything into a digital file. Photos, documents, addresses, meticulously labeled. He wasn't just angry, he was focused. Every step was deliberate. He contacted a civil rights attorney known for lawsuits against aggressive HOA boards and handed over the evidence. Then he sent a copy to a local journalist. But the story didn't spread. No headlines. No breaking news. HOA boards had influence, and Kelly Mason, the president of their HOA, sat on the city planning committee. Nick realized the truth wasn't enough on its own. Not in a place where silence was easier than change. Allison didn't say much. She hadn't spoken more than a few words at a time since the night in the ER. But her silence wasn't hollow, it was dense, heavy. It carried more than sorrow, it carried resolve. She watched the monitors, held Logan's hand and waited. Then on the third day something changed. Logan's fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, unsteadily, his eyes opened. Not fully, but enough. Enough to know he was still there. Still fighting. Allison leaned over him, tears sliding down her face for the first time since it all began. She pressed her forehead to his and exhaled a single word. Hey! Nick stood in the doorway watching. Allison turned and walked straight to him. We're going all the way, she said quietly but firmly. On the 6th day after the attack, Nick's phone rang just after sunrise. The number was unfamiliar. The voice calm and precise. Mr. Grace, this is Agent Donnelly with the Federal Civil Oversight Division. We've received the files you submitted. What you're describing goes well beyond a civil matter. A homeowners association acting as an armed enforcement group, that's a federal concern. Nick stood up straighter, the fatigue lifting from his shoulders for the first time in a week. He stepped out into the hospital corridor, his heart racing. Not with fear this time, but with something sharper. What do you need from me? He asked. Everything, the agent replied. Names, photos, screenshots, messages, any digital trail. Every document you've got. We're opening an investigation. Nick didn't hesitate. He returned to the laptop he kept beside Logan's bed and began organizing everything into folders. His hands finally moved with purpose again. Every piece of data now had a destination. Every name on his list would soon be under review by a federal team. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fight they were losing. While Nick built his case from digital ashes, Allison took a different path. She began reaching out through forums and local support groups, spaces where mothers shared the stories no one else would publish. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for patterns. Within days, she found them. 4 separate families across 3 nearby counties had reported eerily similar incidents over the past 2 years. In one case, a boy collapsed from fear after 2 HOA officers cornered him for riding a scooter on a sidewalk they claimed was restricted. In another, a child was pulled off his bike and interrogated for playing without a visible name tag. The parents had filed complaints, but each time the matter had been quietly resolved. No charges. No stories. No justice. Just silence sealed with waivers and payouts. Allison compiled the testimonies. She didn't pressure the families, just listened. But the more she read, the more the silence around HOA enforcement felt coordinated. Like a curtain drawn over the same act again and again. Meanwhile, Kelly Mason said nothing publicly. But behind closed doors, in city meetings and backroom phone calls, she began to show signs of strain. Whispers circled that someone from her HOA board had spoken out. The federal eyes now lingered on her emails and calendar invites. Then on the evening of the 7th day, Allison's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Miss Grace, said the voice on the line, cool, clipped, familiar. Let's resolve this peacefully. You don't want to stir up more than necessary. There's a lot in the past that's better left alone. Allison didn't respond right away. She walked to the hospital window, looking out over the city as the lights flickered on across rooftops. Her hand tightened around the phone. "You threw a brick at my son," she said calmly. "He lived. And now you won't." The line went silent. That was the moment it all shifted. The pain was still there. But now it had a direction. They no longer stood in the ashes of what had happened. They stood at the beginning of what came next. 2 weeks after the attack, Nick and Allison sat side by side in front of a small camera. The lighting was soft but clear, the background plain. A neutral wall inside Logan's hospital room. There were no theatrics. No shouting. Just quiet determination and the truth. The interview aired on a growing YouTube channel run by civil rights advocates who had covered similar cases, but none quite like this. Allison held up a photo. Logan swaddled in white sheets, a bandage wrapped around his small head, his face pale but peaceful. She spoke steadily, recounting every detail. Not with anger but with clarity. Not just what happened but what led to it, the policies, the threats, the silence. Nick followed with the digital evidence. A screenshot of an internal email casually referencing their address. A joke from one of the HOA officers about teaching young parents, discipline the old-fashioned way. Then came the audio clip. Kelly Mason's voice unmistakable, clipped and clear. "If they won't cooperate, then let them learn who runs this place." The video was 22 minutes long. It wasn't flashy but it hit a nerve. Within 3 days it had over 1 million views. The comments poured in, thousands of them raw, emotional, furious. Asterisk, "This isn't a housing issue. This is a federal crime." Asterisk. Asterisk. "Where were the real police when that brick flew through their window?" Asterisk. Asterisk. "Every mother in America should be standing with Allison Grace." Asterisk. The story spread fast, from local Facebook groups to national news outlets. Allison was invited to speak at rallies against HOA overreach. Her voice shook at first but steadied with each word. Nick launched a petition to dismantle private HOA enforcement teams. It gained 10,000 signatures in under a week. By the end of the month, morning news shows were reciting Logan's name. State senators made statements. One even called for an official audit of all local HOA units acting beyond their bounds. The country was listening. But just when it felt like the tide was turning, something shifted. It was early morning when the knock came. Not a bang, just a firm, deliberate knock. Allison opened the door and found 3 officers from the local police department standing on their porch. Real uniforms. Real. "We received an anonymous tip," one of the officers said, flashing his badge. Allegations of unregistered weapons inside the home. Nick appeared behind Allison. His voice was calm. "We don't have any weapons. We still need to check," the officer replied. "Standard procedure." They let them in. There was nothing to hide. But Allison stood motionless as the officers walked past her into the living room. She watched their movements not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't about safety. It was about pressure. When the officers left, finding nothing, Allison let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't amused. It was tired, resigned, sharp. "She's trying to scare us," she said, glancing at Nick. "Kelly knows she's losing." Nick didn't respond. He just nodded and walked back to his desk, opening his laptop. There was still more work to do. The investigation gained momentum. Federal agents officially launched a probe into the operations of the Fulton County HOA. What began as one family's story quickly unraveled into something much larger. Dozens of anonymous complaints surfaced, reports of intimidation, forced inspections, unannounced raids, even destruction of property. For years, people had remained silent, too afraid to speak up, or convinced no one would listen. But now the silence was breaking. Documents were collected. Testimonies were gathered. Some residents had saved letters, threatening notices with no legal weight but plenty of fear behind them. Others had phone recordings, voicemails from HOA enforcers warning them about everything from the height of their lawn to the color of their door. The evidence painted a picture, not of neighborhood management but of control. In response, Kelly Mason stepped forward with a public statement. She stood at a polished podium in front of HOA headquarters, speaking clearly and confidently. "The Grace family," she said, "is engaging in an effort to destabilize our community and undermine private governance. Their actions risked dismantling years of cooperative work among residents. But it was too late for speeches. The community had already made up its mind. At the next town hall meeting, Allison walked in holding Logan, now out of the hospital, wrapped gently in a soft blue blanket. The room was full. Residents stood and applauded. The sound echoed not just as noise but as meaning. "You are our voice now," said an elderly woman in the front row, her hands clasped over her heart. "You showed us what they've been doing to us all these years." When Kelly Mason took the floor minutes later, the atmosphere shifted. Her usual composure cracked as voices rose from the crowd. "Murderer! You threw a brick at a baby." The room grew tense. Kelly tried to speak again, but the words were drowned out beneath the wave of voices. This time, the town wasn't afraid to talk back. Meanwhile, Nick had secured a meeting with the district attorney. He brought everything: emails, financial records, photographs, even purchase receipts showing that tactical gear for the so-called HOA officers had been bought using a private fund overseen by Kelly herself. The district attorney didn't hesitate. Formal charges were filed within the week. They included unlawful use of force, creation of an unauthorized paramilitary unit, attempted destruction of evidence, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The case moved forward quickly. Given the scale and severity of the allegations, prosecutors requested special legal status for Nick and Allison as victims of targeted aggression. It granted them the right to attend every hearing, view all submitted evidence, and deliver impact statements during sentencing. They weren't just names on a file. They were recognized. And this time the system didn't look away. In court, Kelly Mason no longer looked like the polished figure from press conferences and community events. Her usual confidence had vanished. Her hair hung limp at her shoulders. Her blazer was wrinkled. The sharpness in her eyes had faded into something duller, worry, perhaps fear. She sat quietly at the defense table, hands clasped, as the courtroom filled with quiet anticipation. Nick and Allison each took the stand. Their voices were calm, unwavering. They didn't embellish. They didn't dramatize. They spoke in measured, steady tones, recounting the events exactly as they'd lived them. The brick, the silence, the recovery, the evidence. There were no outbursts, no theatrics. But their words carried weight. They were no longer just a story online. They were a case in a court of law. The prosecution presented its findings: financial records linking HOA funds directly to the purchase of tactical gear, text messages between enforcement members, voice recordings, photos, even jokes about discipline. It all came together like pieces in a clear puzzle. During proceedings, news broke that Dave Thompson and Ken Rudolph had attempted to flee the state. One was stopped at a rest stop in Alabama with weapons in his trunk. The other was caught in Tennessee using false ID. Their arrests were entered into the case. Proof that this wasn't just a string of bad choices. It was a pattern of calculated avoidance. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Kelly's legal team made one final move: a plea deal. 3 years probation. No prison time. The courtroom held its breath as the judge reviewed the motion. Then he spoke, his voice firm, echoing through the chamber. "You orchestrated an act of violence under the guise of authority. You directed others to act, then hid behind bureaucracy. You let a child be harmed. You are not just a threat to one family. You are a danger to the fabric of civil society." He denied the deal. Sentencing was immediate. 10 years in federal custody. No early release. No parole. As the gavel struck, the courtroom exhaled. It wasn't celebration. It was resolution. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters clustered by the steps. One turned to Allison with a microphone, voice eager for a headline. "What do you feel right now?" Allison glanced at Nick before answering. Her voice was quiet but certain. "Peace," she said. Then she paused. "And the strength to build something better." Then she turned, took her husband's hand and walked forward. Not away from the past, but toward something finally within reach. Spring arrived slowly. But when it did, it brought more than warm air and green lawns. It brought quiet. Brought healing. In the backyard of the Grace family home, Nick had spent a weekend building a wooden swing set by hand. It wasn't perfect. Some boards sat at uneven angles, and the paintbrush strokes were thick in places. But it stood strong. And on it Logan laughed. The scar on his temple was faint now, a thin line just above his brow, but it held the weight of everything that came before. Every time Allison pushed the swing and he soared a little higher, he laughed louder. The sound filled the air like sunlight. Neighbors began to stop by more often. Some brought casseroles. Others left cards in the mailbox. A few said nothing at all, just gave a knowing nod across the fence. And one, a retired art teacher, spray-painted a mural on the old HOA office wall before it was boarded shut. In bold, looping letters it read. This time the brick came back. The message spread. Nick and Allison, once private people, filed a formal petition for the full dissolution of the local HOA. What had seemed impossible months earlier was now a public movement. Signatures poured in. Community meetings filled beyond capacity. The momentum was real. 6 months later, the county held a referendum. The turnout was historic. The result? The HOA was disbanded. But Nick and Allison didn't stop there. They knew this wasn't just about one neighborhood. It wasn't just about one child, one brick, or one woman in a blazer. They launched a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families affected by HOA-related harassment and abuse of power. They built a website, a helpline, and a series of short videos telling their story and encouraging others to come forward. In the first video, Allison sat in a simple chair, speaking directly into the camera. No association, she said, should ever be allowed to stand above the law. If it happens once, it can happen again. But if we speak together, loudly, clearly, maybe it never has to. Their story reached far beyond their town. Across the country, other families began to share their own experiences. Stories poured in letters, emails, videos. A network began to form. A new kind of community. One built not on fear but on accountability. And yet, for Nick and Allison, it always came back to something smaller. Backyard afternoons, Logan's laughter, the wooden swing swaying gently in the breeze. Because the story didn't start with a movement. It started with a brick. And a boy who survived it. Because truth, spoken clearly, shared without fear, is its own kind of force. Especially when it hits exactly where it needs to.